Welcome to Hort Culture, where a group of extension professionals and plant people talk about the business, production, and joy of planting seeds and helping them grow. Join us as we explore the culture of horticulture. Hello. I hope the sun is shining where you are, but in the way that like warms you, like that good car nap that you can take when it's like kind of a little chilly outside and warm in the car, and not in the way of like you're really sweating super bad.
Like
and
you feel like your brain is bubbling and your memories are
I've done that.
disappearing.
I've fallen asleep in the car, and it's been in the summer, and I thought I was in the shade, and the shade moved, and it got really sweaty.
Yeah, that
Hopefully the
sounds-
windows weren't up, right?
I was like,
Yeah, mostly they were kind of up a little bit.
he's like,
yeah.
I took a bunch of cold medicine and just took,
Yeah,
went
it
to
was
sleep.
Benadryl. It's fine.
There was an
It's
ambulance
fine.
crew that came.
I may have time traveled in my mind. I don't know. Maybe.
So, I don't know about you, but like the first day that it gets super, like not even super hot, but like the first day it gets over 80 and it's kind of like the sun is out and you know you're acting like it's still in the 70s, and it's just so much hotter than when you're like acclimated in the middle of July.
When
I'm just
80
like,
feels
I'm
cool later in
dying.
the summer. Yeah.
Yeah.
That same temperature, it's a matter of perspective, or maybe it's just tolerance. I don't know.
Like in the spring, how the 40 degrees is, you're outside in short sleeves, but 40 degrees in the fall is like you're bundled up in a sweater. Yeah, there's that acclimation period is always a weird time.
Sometimes
for me.
it's just me ready for the seasons to change. The first cool day in the fall, man, I've got the sweaters out, and I'm like sweating in the afternoon
He's
in
like,
Kentucky.
Yeah, those are the clothes that are clean, right? Like they've been hanging up ready to wear.
They smell funny because they've been in storage for a while, but it's fine. It's fine.
Well, this time of year, your cuticle hasn't formed, and so you're
my waxy covering is thin.
I need my I'm always in long sleeves, so it's always formed. Yeah, it's fine all year. Just pale problems. I'm just covered up. It's fine.
My evapotranspiration rate is through the roof. Just hits me.
Literally.
Just crazy. I bet there's a tiny little microclimate right around Brett. Like just this little evapotranspiration.
That's how he grows those plants so much quicker than you, Alexis. I mean, I don't mean to keep bringing that up.
He comes in and mists me. Humidity around in my immediate vicinity. Yeah, I mean, we've been done with peony season for about 6 weeks now. How about you?
Lies. Actually, so it's funny. I text Annie
about
2 weeks ago, because I was like, all right, it's looking like mine are going to be ready like around the week of Mother's Day or like right before. And so I text Annie and I was like, how far along are your peonies? And she's like, probably today or tomorrow they'll bloom. And I was like, perfect, I'm right on schedule.
You're on.
So I'm like, I just do all my timing by plants.
Or like the like dogwood winter. This is Wample backyard. Yeah, Wample backyard peony spring.
Yeah, it's fun.
It's true.
I love it. I appreciate it. It's I'm cutting crazy amounts of peonies right now. It's very rewarding. So, but anyways, we're not talking about peonies, but we are talking about something that would affect peonies today, or pretty much anything that you grow outside, unless you're growing lotus in your pond. I think that they would be okay with our topic today, which would be too much rain. Because if you're listening to this in the spring, we often get too much rain. And, sometimes in at least Kentucky, we get too much rain in July. But then some years we don't. So who even knows?
Some years we get no rain in July.
And preemptive apology to our West Coast listeners who don't generally have the problem of too much rain or too much water.
Yeah,
we do.
Our thoughts and prayers
are
often
stay moist and fungal and buggy and weedy in these parts.
Yes. And everybody
Swampy,
just cringed
moist.
at the word moist.
Yeah.
Let's listen.
Swampy,
and I said it again. You're welcome.
I don't know. Is it the worst?
Mezzanine.
I don't know what it's called.
Words.
I just know people get creeped out by that word, so I don't know why.
I don't like the word buggy. It just brings up too many bad memories.
Yeah, buggy.
You're from Florida, so that makes sense.
It's buggy outside. I have malaria.
Down south are like, these people have no idea. They're like, they have no idea what this is.
Misophonia.
Oh, yeah.
Some people don't like a lot of, like, moist is a common one. I'll just keep saying it.
Yeah, it's like an aggressive or negative response to like certain mouth sounds. And I think
that's mouth sounds. Yeah.
Like if you don't like it when somebody's chewing with their mouth open next to you, they apparently have a word for that.
Or like when you listen to a podcast or an interview and you can hear that the person's mouth is dry and it's just ooh, let's back off the compression a little bit.
Somehow
We do
I'm
not
like,
need.
I need a drink of water, like as if he's
I
calling
do.
me out
I
for
mean,
it.
I'm
you,
grabbing-
I know,
I
yeah.
would call you. I would stop. I would sabotage this whole thing and stop it and be like, we need to get.
We would not be on this many episodes.
If you and Ray fell asleep in the car, you guys need to get some IV fluids in you before you come into this because we do not
Do
need
not
dry
come in here
mouths on the pod.
dehydrated.
Well, no dry mouth today. Just rain. Just talking about the rain because if it ain't there yet, it's coming. So
Mhm.
yeah, too much rain is what Josh. You said this saying earlier that you had heard about some being dry versus being
Yeah, it was that a dry year will scare you, but a wet year will starve you. And
Mhm.
I think we're kind of mostly, or I was expecting we're mostly talking about how to deal with too much rain in a
Yeah.
gardening sense, right? Like, what are the strategies for dealing with that, and what can you do about it? Because it's not like, oh, well, it's too dry, get the irrigation going if you've got
Right.
like a small enough space. You
It's
can't
really
unirrigate, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The technology is not
interesting.
there.
When you talk about to certain agriculture producers, like I think you said, Josh, that maybe that applied to what rangeland or pastures, maybe, or a certain
Mhm.
type of farming operation. In horticulture, we do things intensively, which usually means there's probably irrigation involved if you're growing field crops. It's just the nature of the business that we are in, and it seems like when I switched, I was prior just an ag agent. I dealt more with cattle and field crops, and then switched over to horticulture. You really needed that rain. There's not a lot you could do. But switched to horticulture, and I knew this was the case that they would rather it be a dry year because you have irrigation anyhow, and you had fewer diseases on the horticulture end of
Mhm.
things. So I guess if a horticulture producer had their choice, they would be just a little bit dry
Mhm.
rather than a little bit wet because of the conditions that you guys have already mentioned of all the diseases that we have here in our transitional zone in the state of Kentucky, the wonderful state of Kentucky, is it seems like every disease that does exist will exist in a wet year,
Yeah.
Facts.
especially in intensive crops. So that's something that's different with horticulture. Not that hort crops, I don't know, in flowers, Alexis, are there flower producers that still don't, I guess it's pretty common not to have irrigation in some of those crops still, or
No, I'd say most because
most of them? Okay.
if you think about it, a lot of them are growing in tunnels. So that's one
Oh,
thing
yeah, true.
where you're
Right.
protected from rain,
Yeah,
but
protected ag.
it's also it can still do some damage and stuff. Too much rain usually brings high winds, and then you don't have sunlight, and there's a whole other thing to that. But they flower growers don't the flowers need a lot of water, they do. So most of
Mhm.
them are irrigating in some
Okay.
way and doing drip. And I don't know, I think when I think about too much rain and maybe like combating that, and then we can talk about the things you're trying to combat with that. Some of
Mhm.
this will be very obvious, I think, but maybe there'll be some new things that you wouldn't have thought of. But I my idea is like, let's start from the ground up with soil. So if
Mhm.
you're in an area where you get a lot of rain, maybe you're farming kind of at the bottom of like a bowl area, which a lot of
Mhm.
people, you don't have a lot of choice sometimes where you're growing things necessarily, or you just are in an area that gets a lot of rain. So combating that with things like slightly raised beds.
Right.
I'm not
Mhm.
talking about, I'm talking about like a more of a commercial side but home gardeners could do this as well, but you're raking that bed up. You're not necessarily
Right.
putting
Mhm.
down, wood planks or cinder blocks. You could certainly do that as a home gardener, but I'm talking building that bed up a little bit higher. And that can be used. I do that, and I know some other growers who do that with certain crops that just like drier. They don't like wet feet is kind of like a terminology we use.
Lavender and all that, certain
Lavender,
crops.
yeah,
On the
exactly.
extreme, yeah.
Yeah, is a great one. Or if you're growing bulbs of any kind, even if you're doing like a turmeric or something like that, like it doesn't want to sit in water. And if you have heavy clay soils, even with a moderate amount of rain, there'll be a period of time where those are really saturated. So building up that
Mhm.
raised bed can be one way to kind of
Yeah.
modify that environment.
Yeah,
You
and you
said
bring up
clay
a great point
soils, yeah.
about I was gonna with raised beds. Like when we say raised beds, a lot of people immediately jump to that idea, like you mentioned, of masonry or wood and
Mhm.
something that's really tall. But just
Physical
even
structure.
having it slightly build up, like just a
Mhm.
few inches, can have a really dramatic impact on that soil being well drained or draining better.
Mhm.
I think about homeowners a lot. Well, and commercially, it's just as important. In the spring, it's typically a wetter, moister time of year. The ground, I always worry about gardeners and even commercial producers getting in the soil and doing soil tillage while the ground is too wet. It's tempting. And if you
Hmm.
just see a brief window where you have a break in the rain and you think your soil is in good enough
Me right
condition
now.
to till, yeah, it just you're doing some damage there. I think about that first is spring tillage operations, and
Yeah.
especially we've had episodes with cover crops on there, and we talked about the effect that a heavy cover crop has on a home garden or a commercial operation. Affects both the same in that it holds moisture, and one of the things you can do to mitigate that is to get that cut down and taken off or just mulched up to let the sunshine in to just try to get the soil in better
Mhm.
shape. But that's the first thing I think of, Alexis. Yeah,
Hmm.
is from a soil perspective, is in the springtime. Getting that, sometimes it's just tough to get the soil worked up
Hmm.
uh, and catch the right window. So yeah, I think about too much moisture in the spring, and it's tough. I think about when we were growing even a crop like tobacco in Kentucky in years past, that it was a stressful time when you just had a really wet run
Mhm.
of weather, and then your plants are ready to go. You don't want those to get too tall. You pull those, and then you have a wet spell, and it's just really tough. You're just watching for any opportunity to get out there, do final tilling, and get plants in the ground. And the temptation to get on that soil when it's a bit too wet is pretty great. Don't do
Hmm.
it. In
Yeah.
short, don't do it.
Yeah, that's key,
Don't do
right?
it.
Is when
Don't
it's
do
so
it.
wet to not get out there for tillage, and also that's a bad time to when the plants are wet to spread disease around if
Yeah.
you're out there
Mhm.
mixing it up. I
Oh
think that's
yeah.
probably the most frustrating is you see it, but all the wisdom is don't get out there and you can't do anything about it right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's later in the season. I guess that flips it right on its end, Josh. That's a great point. Is that's the next thing, especially in horticulture, or I know I've talked to the lab, Alexis, recently, and they were talking about like all the struggles that some new like floral producers, cut flower producers have with diseases.
Mhm.
That's a crop that's planted very close together, like a high density.
Yeah.
But yeah, Josh, I think I like picking green beans and stuff, and you just spread everything when the surface of plants are wet. So really, that shuts you down later in the season in a very different manner.
But if you've got like, you know, I think about transplants, whether it's veggies or, I know people who buy veggie transplants and bring them in from a greenhouse, and, it's always up or down. Sometimes you get the most perfect crop and sometimes they're not great. And, or you're ordering plugs from a big, reputable dealer, but sometimes they can have a little bit of a root. If they have a little bit of a root pathogen issue and you get a lot of rain, that means you've
Mhm.
got these fungal spores essentially that are spreading right through that water, and it's moving, and it'll take, what would in a drier year be just a couple plants in a small area. I mean, it'll wipe out a row going right with the flow
And
of
it's
water.
frustrating. It's a
Mhm.
double whammy. Not only do you have more diseases present, active diseases present, but the conditions are such that you cannot spray. So
Yeah.
diseases just have an absolute field day. They just, blow up exponentially depending on what the disease is. So it is a double whammy for sure when it's wet out there. It's like having a leaky roof. You really need to fix it, but you can't do it when it's raining. It's the kind of thing.
The other thing I think about, and this is going to be more midsummer, I know we're talking a lot about spring, but I get a lot of questions about this, as we approach summer, is my tomatoes are flowering, my beans are flowering, but I'm not getting any fruit,
Yeah.
or, I'm not getting
Mhm.
any bean, I'm not getting any pods. A lot of these things are insect pollinated. If it is
Mhm.
raining, the insects are not moving around, right? The bees aren't going to these things to do that pollination. So, and again, there's nothing you can do about it unless you want to go out and, hand pollinate under a little umbrella or something. There's just, so in wet years, you got disease, you got, yeah, insects not pollinating. So you think about all the things that bees pollinate as an example, and there's just nothing you can do if you're out in the field, unfortunately.
And I think one other thing to touch on that we haven't so far is that lots of rain is something that'll leach out nutrients in your soil as
Hmm.
well. So it's
Yeah.
affecting your kind of fertility
Yeah.
plans.
Yeah.
That's when mineral-based soil growers feel the pain of a
Hmm.
non-mineral based soil grower, or people that are used to growing things in containers with like peat based
Mm-hmm.
media, they're used to having to do a constant micro feed of nutrients because they have to water so much because that media dries out, that they're used to adding those nutrients all the time. Well, the same thing can happen in mineral based soils when you have field crops that are growing. Yeah, that loss of nitrogen can be pretty pronounced. I hear the folks down in Florida and southern states that have a lot more sandy soils, they talk a lot about that. That if you
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of unexpected rain, that effect can be pretty pronounced. So you have to think about the replacement nutrients, especially if you're doing drip irrigation. You look at your rates, and sometimes they'll bump the rates 5-10% based on experience and knowing their soils. So yeah, it's a
Which is
good point.
why like clay soils are not completely bad, right? They hold on to those nutrients. Just a reminder
They
that if
do.
you're dealing with a lot of clay right
They hold
now
on
and
to
you're mad about it,
everything.
it's not
They have
bad. But
attachment
organic
issues.
matter is also so important. And, we talk about that and
Mhm.
other things, but organic matter will hold on to those nutrients better. So really bumping up that, whether that's compost or cover cropping, all those things we've talked about before. Another reason that's so important to combat that rain so that you aren't losing so much into and poisoning the water and all that kind of thing.
So it's
We
bad. Too much rain,
It's bad.
not good.
Not good, but there are some things we can do. We've already hit on some of them. So raised beds as one, just raking up a couple inches,
Hmm.
or if you have a bed shaper, or I use a rotary plow to flip
Hmm.
that soil. It just spins that soil and flips it up onto an area. So you can go as high tech or low tech as you want, but it, I can't think of a reason that would be bad to do that. Even in dry years, again, most people
Hmm.
have some sort of irrigation in horticulture, so like it's never a bad thing. And a lot of people are doing no-till, and essentially what you're doing with no-till is creating over time these little bit of raised beds for horticulture crops. So like all that kind of can go together.
One of
Yeah.
the somebody going to say anything? Brett, were
I
you going to
think
say
if
something?
you are cover cropping and you've terminated or laid your cover crop down or whatever, and it's created this mulch layer that can slow down the process of the soil drying out, and so there's
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of basically from the point that you're kind of looking for this window starting at the very earliest that you could, and you have to sometimes make executive decisions that you have
Mm-hmm.
to till or you have to get in at a time that's not optimal, and you think, oh, I'll make it up on the back end. But I think, to Alexis's point, like as far as things that you can do to overly to future proof your soil or whatever for future years. I mean, you can do things like working toward improving the structure, improving the drainage. Sometimes you'll have an issue where especially if an area has been used for agricultural production for a while and it's been tilled in that top, 8, 10, 12 inches, there will be this phenomenon of the hard
Oh
pan
yeah.
underneath, which is sort of like a false bottom or a bottom underneath, and it can cause things to be even slower in drying out. And so you
Mm-hmm.
could look at using something like a subsoiler, or using something like tillage radishes or something along those lines to gradually improve the drainage of your
Mm-hmm.
soil. You don't want to turn it into a sand box where it's Florida and everything leaches out the bottom, but it is this really interesting, very slow, long-term strategic plan for how you can kind of improve your soil in a number of different ways for plant health, but also it can help to mitigate some of the issues with stuff not wanting to dry out. Now, if
Mm-hmm.
it rains for 5 straight days heavy, no matter
Next
what you
week.
did, you're,
Yeah.
I mean, but it could be that Alexis took care of her soil and improved drainage in her fields and et cetera, and we get a big rainfall and I didn't do anything and mine's still soaking wet and hers is ready in a couple of days of
Mm-hmm.
nice sunshine. And so like those types of things are more in the broad strategic
Yeah.
longer term plan, and
Mm-hmm.
just like with a lot of those ecologically minded things, it helps in multiple different ways, but that is one way that it can provide a little relief.
Another general strategy, and this one I have mixed thoughts on. I guess it's very situational specific, and it sort of gets into the weeds, no pun intended, a little bit.
Nice.
Is there's a couple different strategies depending on if you're home or commercial. If you're a homeowner, one of the things I go over with homeowners, especially if they're wanting to maintain a reduced spray schedule, is space the plants out. If you've had
Mm-hmm.
some rainy seasons and you're fearful of disease transmission, space your plants out, especially crops that have a close canopy later in the season, like tomatoes. Spread those out a little bit, increase sunlight penetration, which increases leaf drying, which makes for undesirable, environments for a lot of these pathogens.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side of that, if I have a rain garden, one of my strategies is to do just the opposite, is to mitigate erosion, which is also associated with too much rainfall. You want to put plants close together.
Mm-hmm.
You're kind of mitigating the force of the rain falling on the soil. Not only that, but you're increasing the root mass, which holds the soil better. So those are
Riparian buffers. Yeah.
strategies that are kind of opposite end of the spectrum, but you can use those strategies either spacing plants farther apart or bringing plants close together, depending on your situation. And I've worked with people on doing both, and both have their place as just
Mm-hmm.
general strategies of dealing with. And sometimes you have to look into the future, the crystal ball, and anticipate some of these issues if you've had problems with some of these things in the past. So, two different strategies, spacing one way or the other can have its place.
On that, excuse me, on that note, if you're a tunnel grower and you're going, I don't really worry too much about too much rain because obviously it's not, really affecting the tunnel. Too much rain means cloud coverage, which means that
Mm,
it's kind of your humidity often will go up. A lot of the times you keep your sides down so that if you've got whipping rain, you're going to keep your sides down so the rain's not coming into the tunnel. And so
mhm.
you're going to build up a higher humidity in there
Yeah.
because your tunnel is closed up. But also there's cloud coverage. And so the, natural humidity that would form is not drying out as quickly because it's in the tunnel. So there is still some effect to too much, having too much rain and essentially too much cloud coverage, and you can get disease will come in
Yeah.
to a tunnel so quick on days like that. So, or a greenhouse or whatever closed environment you might be using.
Mhm.
So you're not completely free from the
Yeah.
from the
Right.
effects of rain.
Well,
Yeah.
and I mean, a tunnel could have been installed in a place that is somewhat flood prone, right? Like
Yeah.
I've definitely seen water in
Oh,
Oh
yeah.
Lord,
from the
yeah.
side.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people put tiles now, have end up
Mhm.
putting tiles out
Yeah.
Yeah.
or
Which
I
gutter
remember when the
systems
hot
or
that
tunnels
brings
something.
up
first
a
started
pretty good
coming in. Yeah.
strategy. Is I mean, there's a million and one names for this concept: a drain tile, a French drain, a weeping tile, an ag drain,
Mm,
a subsoil drain, and they're all kind of terms around this idea of digging a trench and backfilling it in a certain way
mhm,
to give the water somewhere to go,
mhm,
and thereby kind of improve drainage overall for an area. And that's definitely a strategy.
mhm,
If you're stuck planting in a place that is flood prone, or you're concerned about the future potential of rainfall events and things like that, or just worried about its drainage potential, but you're stuck working with it, that kind of like a
yeah,
French
it's a good
drain or
point.
rock drain is a
And
great way
just
to
to be
go.
clear, this wouldn't be like, oh, I just put out a bunch of whatever my crop is, and I'm noticing that it's backing up. I'm going to put in a French drain. It's more of a
Right.
infrastructural, and that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what we're saying about the soil stuff. Like a lot of
Mhm.
it is there are things you can do to respond
Preventative.
in the season, but
Mhm.
Hmm.
almost everything with this
Yeah.
type of structural, geographical, geological consideration requires forethought and or
Mhm.
wow, that really flooded out this year. I'm going to need to do something different, when we get a chance to get in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the long term strategy, and the idea of being in a place for a while and thinking through how to make it work better for you is this type of stuff. And yeah, that's like the sort of the engineering equivalent of what I was talking about earlier with the if the tillage radishes
Mhm.
and the subsoiling and stuff isn't quite enough, you may need to intervene even further, or it's
Yeah, if you're looking
pretty
to
interesting stuff.
go
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
Something I learned in preparing for this show was that the French drain isn't of French origin.
I
Like
was gonna ask, is it French?
I mean, there's like an aside that it may have been invented in France, but I mean, I'm pretty sure it's an old idea. But the reason we call it a French drain is because of a guy, Henry Flagg French of Massachusetts in the mid 1800s, who articulated like how to develop one, and
Mm,
like kind of made it broadly
known.
popularized and stuff like that in a, I guess it's an article called Farm Drainage,
Mm.
1859.
Wow.
Aptly named.
Must
Nice.
read.
Must read.
Right.
Yeah. You and on that note, again, much more thorough that the French drain, the ag drains are kind of a semi immediate. Like you could do it in one season, but if you wanted to kind
Mhm.
of, I like the idea of always like stacking things and how do I
Yeah.
make something work. So like in flower farming, for an example, but this could be for if you're doing like agroforestry or something like that. Ray was talking about earlier, like rain garden plants where you're kind of slow in that water. You need a lot of plant roots to suck up that water. You do the same sort of thing
Mm-hmm.
where if you've got like a hill that's coming down, a lot of water runs onto maybe where you're growing and it's coming from maybe one main direction. You can put in like some shrubs or some trees,
Hmm.
grass, some native grasses type things where it's going to
Mm-hmm.
slow that runoff first of all, but then they're going to suck up a lot of that water, and then maybe you can use those. Maybe your orchard, obviously you don't want your orchard to be in the rain, but I'm just saying if there's a lot of moving water type of situation,
Yeah.
you can put your orchard there, or your blackberries, or if you're doing ornamentals, you can do you know Wagelia or forsythia, or any of these things. And we've talked about making habitat for birds that help with your insect pests and stuff like that. So there's kind of this multi-way to think about using an area, and all the different ways it can help you, so you're not wasting that area. Like I know a lot of people like have a hard time with putting in like trees and things like that if they're more into more
Not trees.
traditional, yeah,
Yeah.
more traditional, just like big open blank spaces, not really realizing all the ways you can use those areas. Brambles are a great way to like
Mm-hmm.
really slow down some water. They'll suck it up. They don't want wet feet, but they're much better at sitting in water, and then you can pick off of them, right? So like you're going to make money off of that area if
Well,
that's
you're definitely moving into like the kind of permaculture principle stuff. I can see
sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Josh getting
So
excited
sorry.
over there. It's
Yeah.
the idea of like keeping water on the farm and slowing it
Yeah.
down and giving
Hmm.
it a
Yeah.
place to go and a place to be stored and held, and the way that that has like a cumulative effect, on the entire
Hmm.
property. And even just, we talked about Josh's publication that he had done on the excuse me, the ecosystem services of plants, and the idea of a tree's canopy slowing down water as it holds on to all the droplets of water. He
Mm-hmm.
gives the example of go stand under a tree after it just rained and shake one of the branches and see how much water comes off all over you. That same
I,
principle of just, it's like this really, once you start really thinking about water flows on your farm, and in this case, managing the downsides of that, you
Hmm.
can really, your brain can go to some really crazy wild places of
We spent so much time on this,
engineering.
Brett, in the eastern foothills, and my dad, the fields, some of the fields we were using were marginal, and we use those for row crops. Once again, primarily, for things like tobacco and some horticulture crops. But it was interesting how the farm had developed over the years with my father, and it was all to manage erosion and
mhm.
Hmm.
both the flow and the magnitude of water that would accumulate, which is massive. We'd have these weird people drive along and they'd say, and they wouldn't realize that there was as much slope as there was in a field, but there was areas where dad would leave green buffer strips because he
Hmm.
knew that if he
Yeah.
tilled that, it would start as a little tiny stream and end up as a gully, 3 feet deep. He just knew that because of just years of experience. And he had spent so much time just honing this really interesting system of how to orient the rows and breaking up
Hmm.
blocks and providing water drainage and buffer strips to slow the velocity of the water. I mean, over time, everything was kind of finely tuned, but when he turned over a couple fields to me, some of my first fields, and he let me make these mistakes, I'm sure. I went, and what did I do? I tilled everything. Because if you till everything, that means you can
Yeah.
put in
More
more.
space for more crops, more money in the
Ray is a
Hey,
pocket.
that's
fence row
more
to fence row
tomato.
guy.
That was more
Right.
tomato plants. I was super excited, but he gave me these small little fields, and they were sandy, and I had to go back in and fill in 2.5, 3 foot ditches.
Hmm.
And he's like, well, why do you think that happened? And, we had this big, long discussion one day, and he put it in his own down to earth, practical terms. And I'll never forget it that I did not put enough emphasis and consideration into managing those fields. And I was like, well, this really stinks. I'm filling up a 3-foot hole here that runs a quarter of a mile. And Dad's like, well, you could have, you could have avoided that if you had left that buffer strip alone. And I was like, but that's more tomatoes. And it was my mistake. So
Right.
Yeah.
yeah, if
Well,
you've got
and
any kind of slope at all, you have to be, Brett,
Mhm.
that's a great point. You just have to be so careful with what you do when you do it. Yeah.
And in
Yeah.
general, with a lot of these, longer term thinking about managing around water and soil erosion and all that stuff, you realize that it takes 10 years to make progress and like 10
Mhm.
minutes to screw it up.
It takes one
Right.
ray,
You
one
know what I
year
mean?
to go and
And
mess up a couple of these
and
fields. Yeah.
that's just that's the way it goes. And you learn, like you said, you learn from it and move on. And so, I mean, we've talked a good bit about the soil based, a little bit more of the longer term infrastructural considerations,
Mhm.
topography, hydrology. We've covered a lot of ground there. But like, what about the other components of having too much rain? Some of the things that maybe we can deal with within the
In the
course of the
short term.
season.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
thinking
in the
about things
season, yeah.
like
Well,
disease as an
Yeah.
well,
example.
Yeah.
it's
But
not a disease, but one thing that always got me, and I still work with people on, and it still keeps us up at night in commercial horticulture, and that is cracking. I don't know
Oh,
if you
mm,
guys
yeah.
have ever had to work with like a melon grower or a tomato grower, and it's been a
Mm.
dry season, even though they've done a pretty good job of irrigating, staying on a schedule. A rainy spell comes towards the end of the season. Nothing will ruin your day as a commercial producer. Yes, diseases are bad, but so is like an acre of tomatoes that all the shoulders have cracked on and just
Mhm.
destroyed the commercial value of. And the only way you can mitigate that as a producer, I think, is, soil type and a lot of other factors go into kind of managing that. But is to have like irrigation that's good and even throughout the season and just hope for the best towards the end of the season. If you just have an unusually wet spell, you're probably going to have some issues, whether it's a watermelon or a tomato. Lots of
Mhm.
fruit, when they get engorged with water towards the end of the growing season, they will just crack wide open.
I feel that after Thanksgiving. My
Yes,
pants.
absolutely. I mean, it's that
Yeah.
stuffing.
gorge.
Like
It's
replace
stuffing the
water
stuffing.
with gravy.
Turkey and
Gravy,
Gravy.
gravy.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
The key
I
is
think,
moderation,
yeah.
Alexis, with the
Well, and
gravy.
raised beds, we're going back to, it all goes
Hmm.
back to, if you have raised beds, in theory, they should drain a little faster, and maybe you have a little bit less time for those plants to just like engorge themselves with water. So
Yeah, yeah.
that can be one way. I think when we talk about disease, and disease goes to those those abiotic issues like cracking, right?
Hmm.
Or, if you have the nutrient leaching because of so much rain can lead to disorders, and then you have disease problems that come in as well. And so I think the keys with disease, no matter the time of year, but especially when it's rainy, is going to be as much prevention as you can do. And we've talked about prevention from a soil perspective, but prevention in sprays. And so it's hard to
Mhm.
spray. Again, if it's raining for 5 days, there's really nothing you can do. But getting something on really quickly after that rain, or depending on what you're using, if it's something that is going to, quote unquote, soak in and putting that on at the right amount of time before rain, if you see that coming. So being preventative and knowing what the weather is
Mhm.
going to do, if you can get some of that in there. And you're still going to have issues with the things that form like right on the leaf surfaces, because, pretty much all of our treatments for those, like I'm thinking about powdery mildew, things like that, are going to
Mhm.
be surface. Most of our treatments are like, and if it's raining, you can't get anything on the surface, but there are some diseases, root rots, things like that, where you can get some things down that are systemic. And so it's in the cells essentially. And that can help really deter that. And then getting those plants, dry quickly. Obviously, if you're out in a field, you're probably not going to put fans on stuff, but like if you are in a tunnel situation and you're dealing with that high humidity, getting some fans running in there to
Mhm.
dry the leaf surface. And then good pruning tactics. So, are you pruning your tomatoes and suckering them correctly? If you're doing fruit trees or even brambles, are you making sure that you're taking out enough so that air movement can get through there? So as soon as it's done raining, that leaf surface is drying out because the air is getting through there. Even if the sun's not out, you can get some movement, dry out that leaf surface, and then you don't
Mhm.
get the buildup of disease that you normally would get.
Yeah, I think just a couple of metaphors or something. With a lot of the fungicides, you have to think of it more like sunscreen ahead of getting
Mm-hmm.
sunburned than aloe vera after you've already been sunburned.
That's a great
In
one.
other words, it's preventative, and so
Mm-hmm.
people come to you if you have powdery mildew. That powdery mildew is not going to respond in general to fungicides. And so you'll see people who grow things that are really fungal susceptible, like grapes, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Those people monitor the weather, and they monitor, disease risk and sentinel plots and all kinds of other stuff, and they will preemptively spray ahead of a rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other metaphor or example, I guess, is that idea of pruning. I think is really important. It's like one of the overlooked cultural practices, for especially for home gardeners. But think about, like, if you have a pile of wet clothes and you take them and you just lay them in a pile, they're just going to stay wet and start
Mm-hmm.
smelling weird. Whereas if you take them and hang them up on a line spaced out where the breeze can blow across them, they can dry out. That
Mm-hmm.
drying out limits in the case of the plant leaves, where they're all bunched up together in a not pruned plant, they can't dry out, and cold and wet is perfect conditions for some
Mm-hmm.
fungal fun.
Bacterial too, yeah.
Yeah, bacteria, everything. It just that thrives in that moist environment. And so you just think about it in terms of, if you want something to stay dry. Like, in general, we would prefer if the plants could take up the moisture from their roots, put it out to everything, and everything else would stay dry. I mean, that's why the Central Valley of California does so well, is because
Mm-hmm.
pretty much
Yeah.
they get water only where they put it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think and one thing I just wanted to clarify, something I had to learn a long time ago. But when you talk about raised beds,
Mm.
some people might have in their mind like built frame wooden boxes of raised beds,
Yeah.
and that is a type of raised bed. But in the biz, like Alexis is in, and like we're talking about, so with some commercial stuff, a raised bed could literally just be a long mound of soil that
Mound of
sits
soil. Yeah.
above the
Raking it up.
profile of the rest of the soil. And so if you're
Right.
thinking, oh no, I have to build all these boxes and buy all this stuff. No, that's not what we're just talking about. Just where you build it up so it's a little bit higher than everywhere else, and there's a little, like, kind of a long mound, like a caterpillar or like a dune worm or something. I don't know.
That's a
In the
big mound,
soil,
Brett. That's a big
yeah,
mound.
maybe a
Mm-hmm.
little smaller, like a baby worm.
Well, think about your grandmother, how she planted cucumbers. They planted them in hills.
Yeah,
And
Yeah,
there's very
hills.
good
Like
reasons.
potatoes, right?
Yes, it's the same thing. And that was an old heritage technique before the advent or the widespread availability of, these complex chemicals, is they had to do good cultural practices, which means, putting a seed in soil that is warmed and well drained and ready to go, fast germination, and something that's growing well and germinates fast has less issues with some of these pythium disease, all these different dampening off diseases. But it's amazing that those cultural practices evolved for a reason. So there's a reason why grandmother put cucumbers or whatever, watermelons in hills, or
Mm-hmm.
potatoes, for a different reason or two. But yeah, some of that was because they didn't have the chemicals, the rescue treatments. We
it's
still
funny
don't have
because,
rescue
I
treatments.
mean, IPM is basically do that still, knowing
Yes.
that you have in your
Pioneer
back
spirit.
pocket the modern chemicals.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
just rely on it. So, yeah, that's awesome. The OG raised bed.
Yeah. If you think about it, that was the original raised bed. It not only was warmer, but drier. So, yeah.
I really liked Brett's example of the hanging up the clothes on the vine. Where I
Mm-hmm.
thought he was going to take it was similar to the importance of making sure that your trellised plants are hung up and kind of like have those open airflow and all that stuff as well.
Yeah. We just had certain fields that, I mean, not even moisture, not even excess moisture, but typical moisture next to a river. We had
Hmm.
fields that would be and Alexis mentioned it earlier. When we think of moisture, we think of just rain falling out of the sky, but there's a lot of other things that can get you. And humidity and things like fog and relative humidity, all that plays into that, and it's just as conducive for diseases. But we had some of those fields that were sort of in oxbows of the river, and they had a high relative humidity, very low air drainage, very low airflow. And every single year we knew that if the chemical label said spray preventatively every 7 to 14 days, guess which interval we would do every 7 days, because we knew that those areas produced diseases unlike any other area on the farm. And
Mm-hmm.
that's another thing, I guess, if you're a homeowner, I spend a lot of time stressing that if something like a chlorothalonil broad spread, fungicide. Says on the label, spray every 7 to 14 days. Look at the weather, look ahead. If there's a wet pattern coming, use that, closer interval of 7 days rather than 14 days if you have higher humidity. But yeah, there's just some areas that, and Alexis already kind of spoke to that, is certain areas or certain way you plant certain areas is, it's going to be worse for diseases.
Another
Harder to learn
little
farm.
tip that can be helpful for a variety of crops, flowers, fruits. I mean, a lot of stuff, just to point home how that pruning, maybe it's not something you've thought of, but base pruning of taking the leaves off within about 6 to 12 inches, depending on the size of the plant, of the soil, to prevent soil splash from being
Mm,
able to reach those leaves. Mulch is a great way to do that as well, but that's not
Mhm.
always practical in every situation. So sometimes it's easier. You see this on tomatoes. I've seen this done in dahlias and zinnias, all kinds of things, where if you can prevent some of that soil splash from getting up there, as well as kind of, usually the plant has a lot of foliage at the bottom, and as it grows, it doesn't necessarily need that much 'cause it's got a bunch up top where the wind is getting to it. But at the base of the plant, sometimes that wind isn't drying that out. So you can thin that out or remove it completely, and you got a little bit of a naked stem at the bottom. And, it's not perfect for every situation, but it is an option that I think can be really helpful for a variety of different crops. So it's technically pruning, but not always the way we think about pruning in a lot of horticulture crops. So I just thought of that one suddenly. It was like, I must tell you.
Yeah, and if you watch your tomatoes this year, you'll notice that they almost always get sick from the bottom up
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
because it's down low, and that's where
That's
the
where the
Slow,
soil
low
splash
the
growth.
splash.
happens,
Yeah.
and yeah,
Ladders up. It's the classic ladder effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those,
Yeah.
those, I figured those leaves are going to die anyway. So I'll go ahead and get ahead of that curve.
Mm-hmm.
Just take
and
them
I
off.
I
Yeah.
think something maybe unspoken amongst us, but you can find hybrid cultivars that have been bred with
Mm-hmm.
resistance to certain
Sure.
diseases.
Mhm.
So maybe blight, or it has a particular resistance to powdery mildew or something like that, depending on whatever the crop is. That's another way that you can kind of, you know, it's one of those tricky aspects. I used to be very crunchy, very
Very granola.
hippie vibe, yeah, and I still have some of those sensibilities. But when I hear people talk about and get really excited about growing heirloom varieties of things, or even growing like fruit
Mm-hmm.
trees and things like that, and there's this homestead kind of
Vibe.
spirit about what they're doing. And I want to be so supportive, but I also don't like setting people up for unrealistic expectations. And the thing is, if there's a reason why commercial growers grow a lot of the hybridized tomatoes that sometimes are even grafted to have additional disease resistance, and a lot of those old heirloom cultivars don't have that. They are delicious and tomatoes, for instance, they're delicious and amazing and incredible. But if you want to feel defeated, go through a year trying to grow all heirloom tomatoes in a moist, hot
Yeah.
A wet
summer
year.
in the
And
South. And it's not like it can't be done. It's just
yeah.
there is a different mentality, a different level of cultural practice that you need to go
Mm-hmm.
through. And
Well, and I also like, and not to, I'm not going to say the words that freak people out, but and everybody says, "Well, my grandmother did it and she, never sprayed." Well, yeah, okay, and let's just say you're using the same exact cultural practices. You may even be using that heirloom seed that has been passed down through generations, which is cool as heck. But Kentucky is not the same place it was when your grandma was growing those heirloom tomatoes. Okay. Like it just is. The weather is different. Call it whatever you want. But like we know that the data shows that our summers are hotter. We have rain at weird times we never had them before. We have the weirdest winters every year. And so you're not growing, it's not comparable. It's not apples to oranges anymore of growing those heirloom tomatoes. So like,
Instead of just growing 4 plants like grandmother did, if you apply that logic to 400 plants,
yeah.
you're increasing the disease load exponentially. So the logic doesn't scale real well sometimes there. Yeah,
Yeah. So
for
just a
heirlooms.
thought process. If you do fail and you're feeling bad about yourself, don't, because you're not it's not apples to apples always. So, it's okay. So just giving you a little boost there. Everything's going
yeah,
to be okay. It's just
yeah,
plants.
That's right.
I know we've talked a lot about field crops, but I'm thinking about the landscape too, and all the ways. I've got I think it's an angel wings lilac out front right now, and it's cracking me up because I pruned it back and it had a flush of new growth, which means one thing, and it looks terrible now because it is floppy. I don't know if I mean, but every time I get a rain now, Jennifer says, "What have you done to this plant? It looks terrible." Where I pruned it back because it was getting overgrown and it's floppy. But is there
The
any strategy? I
new
mean, like in landscapes, rain affects that too. But there's some things I probably could have done to get in front of that floppy plants. But even I think we
When
mentioned
did you prune it?
I pruned it early in the spring, early this spring. I pruned everything that was old, all the older shoots there, 3 years or older, actually probably 2 years or older because it was really overgrown. And what that's left is a bunch of very limber new growth.
Mhm.
And now when
Mhm.
rain hits the leaves,
Yeah.
rain does a lot in landscapes, not only to plants, the shrubs like this lilac, but I think about trees and all the weight that rain puts on leaves. And in the eastern part of the state, I worked a lot with community trails development, and that is when all the trees would fall over trails, and
Mhm.
they would start to during these wet periods, if you're in the gorge or in hilly areas, that rain has a huge impact on plants, especially on slopes and in landscapes. But this made me think about it. This plant right out front where everybody can see, it is flopped over now, and it's still flopped over and looks terrible. But I guess what would have been a pruning strategy if I have something like a bee balm, or what is it, you Brett, that has some phlox. I mean, plants like that. I couldn't remember if you did or
yarrow,
not. Yeah,
peonies.
yarrow. You can actually. I could have pruned those back to stimulate branching. Would have been a much sturdier plant rather than taking them all the way to the ground. But did I use forethought? No. I just went ahead and removed everything because I was sick of it. It's a beautiful plant, but it was too big. But
Mhm.
there's some strategies there that you can deal with, like hydrangeas. I mean, there's a certain
Mhm.
plants that the nature of the way that they grow, the flopping in landscapes, I take note of a lot when I drive around and it's been really wet and it's in the springtime and summer and
So
I see all these.
judgy.
I am. I'm like,
Did
they
you
really should have headed that back. And
did you
that's
put the
me.
lilac where it is, or was it there
It
already?
was there when I came. Yeah.
That's part of it too, right? Is it maybe
Oh,
you
it's
would
not
you would
me.
have you
Yeah.
would have put it in a different spot
It's not
that
my
had more
fault.
space and
Yeah, I planted a standard French lilac, but it has plenty of room to grow, and it is not floppy. I will have
no,
you
not
guys
floppy.
know,
Well, it's
not
because it has
floppy. But
it has your favor, The other
yes,
one's
it
like,
has. It's
good
in the
luck,
blessed
buddy.
realm. Yes, good luck. May the odds be
I
forever in your favor.
I would just characterize it as look at like anybody who's gone way too long without a haircut, they get
Yes,
something kind of drastic, and in the first month or so, it looks weird.
let's call it a period of acclimation. I like that spin, Josh, a lot. Yeah, but there's some ways that you can prune, and you guys have mentioned mulch earlier. I mean, that's kind of a big thing in landscape beds, and there's sprays that you can. And I've used when I was a commercial landscaper that in sloping areas, it's the type of mulch, but also you can get products to spray on mulch that it's a locking
Hmm.
spray that locks mulch, and like it won't go anywhere, is on slopes, and it's a wonderful material.
Hmm.
There's a lot of strategies to mitigate erosion and to keep soil where it's supposed to be and to manage plants in a certain way. You guys have already mentioned the most important things, which is like the pruning methods to open up the
Mhm.
canopy and
Pruning,
release some of the
spacing, all
humidity.
that. Yeah.
Yes,
All
all of
that can
that
be
in landscape.
applied.
Yeah, everything we're saying about commercial field production can apply to the home landscape because it's just kind of general concepts and
Mhm.
principles. Yeah,
Yeah,
Mhm.
I
absolutely.
think of stuff like, I mean, always engineering and digging stuff, but like trenching to redirect where water flows. If you've got some place where water
Yeah,
moves really
engineering.
fast, like what's
Hmm.
coming off of collected roofs and gutters, to have
Yeah.
Rain
rocks and
barrels.
hardscaping there, something to slow the water
Yes.
down,
Yes.
things like that. And like you had mentioned with the not exactly like terracing, but in places of a lot of slope, to have those kind of strips of
Yes.
ground cover that is not
Mhm.
getting tilled to kind of hold on to things and preventing it from
Yeah.
digging a nice quarter-mile rut or
Yeah, a lot of the trails I worked with, like multi-purpose community trails, like the one thing we would do is do something simple like deberming a trail. Is like
Mhm,
when it starts to form a gully, the first thing you do is put a little slope on that of where it slopes towards the downhill because you don't have a lot of manpower to maintain these miles of
Mhm.
trails, and so you design them in a certain way to shed water. It's all about water, the
mhm,
velocity and the
Mhm.
magnitude of water. That's that, and the soil type. That's what defines how you design these trails. But yeah, it's just what you're saying, Jay. It's the engineering, and a lot of times it's just simple things you can do. You don't want water to ever accumulate and gain
Mhm.
speed, because then bad things, I guarantee,
Right,
will
right.
happen, and it will be like the field I had growing up that my father let me manage for the first time that I ruined. Had a 2 foot ditch
It's
in
like
it.
the Grand Canyon. I look at that and I'm like,
Yeah,
somebody messed
exactly,
up.
exactly. Yeah.
Somebody messed up.
So who designed this place? Who designed it? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking of the phone calls we're going to get, Alexis, when we get these wet spells as being county extension agents. Do you ever get any calls about like things that look like fingers growing out of mulch, or like fairy rings in lawns? When we have wet spells, it really does spark a certain type of phone call into extension offices.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like
Mm-hmm.
the period of
Dog
molds and
vomit
mushrooms.
fungus.
Yes,
Yeah, I was gonna
slime
say you get
molds,
people like
slime
a lot of
molds.
stuff appeared in my yard. I ran out and ate several handfuls of it. What is gonna happen?
We get a lot of people like, can I eat this? No. No, you cannot
You
You
eat that
should.
can eat it,
mulch.
but will you
One
survive it?
time you can eat it once, yeah. But I mean, it just wet period brings out a certain type of phone calls, wet
Hmm.
diseases and other
A
stuff,
lot
other
of a lot of
fungi.
pictures come through my email that if anybody else were to see, they might be like, that might be inappropriate. And I'm like, it's a fungus, I swear. So
Yes, and it smells terrible. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I don't want certain people going through my email in the spring for the mulch phone
yeah.
call. Mulch
Yeah,
pictures.
it's amazing, and some of these things just look otherworldly. So I get it. If you've never observed, like, and you have fresh mulch, and you've all of a sudden got this glowing yellow mass of slime. I mean, people call with a high amount of concern, and I get it. That does some of this stuff looks wild, and
Yes.
Mhm.
usually the solution to that is, in most cases, is aeration or just somehow drying that area out. Because once again, it goes back to moisture. That's
Remove
what
it
we're
with a
talking about today.
shovel, throw it in the garbage can.
That's my
Everything will
answer
be
to a lot
Kill
of
fine.
it with
problems in life,
fire.
Alexis.
Kill it with
Yes.
fire.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's kind of sum this up here briefly. Basically, if you are preparing for, if you have the luxury of having some time, some to do some things, you can look at, how do I slow water down? How do I get my plants kind of above any sitting water with raised beds? You can do some drainage or like put in some drains if you need to, and just kind of look at the way water flows and try to work with it, not against it, I think is the easiest thing
Mhm.
to say. And then if you're already planted your stuff and you're like, oh crap, if you can plant future things a little further apart, if you're worried about disease issues, especially if you're organic and you're really limited to what you're spraying, making sure you can dry out those things is really important. But you can also do pruning techniques, get some airflow through there, and then prevention is key. So looking and watching the weather, getting preventative sprays down, again, whether that's organic or conventional, is going to be really important to get you through the season. So I
Mhm.
think that's
Yeah.
mostly it. Really,
And I would
yeah,
say, just to reiterate, when it's wet out there, don't run out until, and when
yeah,
all the
oh
plants are
yeah,
Mm,
wet, don't run out
yeah.
there and hug all of them.
Don't
yeah.
do
Don't
pruning when it's wet. Don't do
yeah.
tillage operations, all
Try
of the
not to
things. Yeah.
pick either. There's nothing worse than like, even if you're not doing flowers, it's especially true, but like tomatoes, if you pick in a bunch of wet tomatoes and you're putting them in the bucket and you come back later and they're real weird, right? So try not to do that. And if any of your plants have been underwater, if any of your lettuce or your tomatoes or melons have been underwater, you might not want to eat those, and you certainly don't want to sell them, because you can get E. coli very easily from things like that. So just a little extra tidbit about how not to get E. coli this year, or give someone E. coli this year. So all right, anything else, guys?
I think that's it.
Awesome. All right, well, the usual ending spiel. Thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions about, this, I know we threw the little E. coli thing at you last minute, but if you have more questions about produce best practices trainings, all of us on the podcast can help you with that. And actually, Brett, I think, helped train me. So we're all fairly educated and can help you with that. And you can send us an email, hortculturepodcast at l.uky.edu. That is in the show notes. Follow us on Instagram. You can also message us on there, horticulture podcast. and see what we're up to. And I try and throw some things up on that, but you can also send us messages if you've got questions. And we like to share a lot of information about other great organizations out there that we work with, and so you might pick up some cool things from Oak or some of these other places that we work with. So we appreciate that. And if you want to leave us a review and tell us that you are not going to drown any of your plants this year, that would be excellent. We would greatly appreciate it. And we hope that as we grow this podcast, you will grow with us and that you will join us next week. Have a great one.